What I try to do is, in response to Henry's request that I say a few words about lessons from NPT history of withdrawals and violations, I do kind of a, almost a devil's advocate issue spotting for you across some of the problems that I see with the regime, the nuclear nonproliferation regime that is right now. But I do want to say up front that although I'm going to point to a lot of problems, please do not interpret me as being an opponent of the regime. Far from it. I take sort of a tough love approach sometimes, but I think you have to be honest about challenges that you face if you're going to take the regime seriously. And there is too much tendency to take it less seriously than it deserves in pointing out this problem. But I do think the NPT has been of incredible value to international peace and security. It's a key factor in ensuring that we did not see the tide of proliferation that so many observers expected. When looking at the international arena, going back to the, say early 1960s or something. We do not live in that massively proliferated world, at least not yet. And the NPT is one of the reasons that we don't, and we should be hugely thankful for that. So let me be clear about that. I also want to point out that the NPT has been of enormous benefit to every non-nuclear weapons state by helping them all be much more secure through what is in effect a worldwide exchange of non-proliferation commitments. In the form of agreeing to Article 2 of the NPT, so that each non-nuclear weapon state can have confidence that its neighbors and its rivals won't acquire nuclear weapons. So you hear a lot of nonsense to the contrary, but please remember, nobody benefits from the NPT more than the world's nuclear weapons have-nots. That is so often forgotten in NPT discourse. So I do think the treaty has incredible value, and I do think it needs to be absolutely preserved. That said, its history of dealing with violations and withdrawals since the end of the Cold War and looking to the future is not a particularly reassuring one. I think the last time, if I recall correctly, Henry, the last time I talked to an NPAC Public Policy Fellows event was back in 2017 when I was at the White House. And I made the argument then that the NPT regime has had really terrible trouble responding quickly enough to proliferation challenges in order to make a difference. And the classic case there is Iran. I could also talk about North Korea, but I think I'll drop that bit in the interests of time. Perhaps we can hit that in the Q&A. And besides, we have Richard on the line as well. So I'm almost hesitant to say anything about the Korean Peninsula at this point. But to talk about Iran, as you may recall, public revelation of Iran's previously secret work to develop a fissile material production capacity for its nuclear weapons program. That public revelation first occurred in August of 2002, and yet it was not until December of 2006 that the first UN sanctions were imposed against Tehran for that very same nuclear mischief. The international community, to be sure, was able to muster the collective willpower to start putting pressure on Iran, but by the late date at which that much pressure became politically possible, the amount of pressure that could be mustered was insufficient in light of where Iran had moved to. In other words, Iran had moved on to a different stage of its program and was more committed to it than before, more committed than the amount of pressure that the United States and the international community could put together. So at every step, the political will, when the political will developed to impose more pressure, Iran's continuing progress ensured that that particular amount of pressure wasn't adequate. So the international community was always just a little bit behind the curve, a little bit too little and a little bit too late. The JCPOA did not, the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action didn't really change that trajectory, for in effect all it succeeded in doing, for so long as it did, was to get Iran to temporarily suspend its nuclear work in return for promises that after a few years' time, no one would ever again pressure it to slow its fissile material production capacities. That's not precisely a non-proliferation success, and although Tehran has now moved more quickly to build its production capacities than it would have done had the JCPOA remained in force and had Iran followed those rules, to be sure, Iran has today succeeded in positioning itself exactly where the JCPOA was eventually going to permit it to be anyway. So whatever the timing, the real legacy of that agreement was always going to be that Iran's nuclear program was given international legitimacy as Tehran positioned itself as a kind of virtual nuclear weapons possessor, able to, in theory, able to very quickly sprint to weaponization. So I think this is not really a success story, and it's about as close to one that the international community has really had in the face of really blatant NPT violations, except for the North Koreans. But we'll not touch that on that right now. But obviously North Korea is clearly not a success story either. So that's one set of problems. And I guess